Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to talk about the Severan Dominate and secessionism in the Imperium of Man in general. Now, the Severan Dominate, which will be our primary source and example for this, is a currently ongoing secessionist movement in the periphery subsector in the Cultists sector. We will be using this as our primary example for the simple reason that it, unlike the vast majority of secessionist movements, actually has a fair bit of lore to it, as it was fleshed out quite a bit in the Only War sourcebooks. But first, a word from our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, the top mobile and PC dungeon delving strategy game with over 600 unique champions spread across 14 factions. And you can get in on the action now by scanning the QR code on screen or clicking the link in the description below. And today, I will show you my top 3 factions, starting, obviously, with the Skinwalkers. For my love of all things rat-like is well known, and the Skinwalkers provide a pair of rodent comrades for those of advanced taste like myself, and a very angry porcupine. What more could you possibly want from a faction? And number 2 on my list are the Shadowkin. Not only because Lady Babyhorns here has been a key part of several of my dungeon delving teams for months, but also because I am a massive weeb, and thus large hats and katanas are always great. And finally, number 3, the Barbarians, because they know what it's like to live in the frozen hellscape that is Norway, and because Eldar Skag was again my first legendary lord and has helped me through quite a lot of content. And speaking of content, the Big Awakening update introduces the Iron Twins Fortress, a big new mechanical challenge for you to conquer, with special rewards allowing you to awaken champions and give them powerful blessings. And that is still not all. If you download and play right now for 7 days, then you get the much anticipated Ultimate Death Knight, a doughty defender that will no doubt be a great asset in your adventures. And even there, the generosity does not end, as we also have the DK Rise promo code to help level him up all the way. And for new players, if you join now, you get almost $30 worth of free starter pack value and the free champion Aina plus in-game loot. And you will find all of these rewards here in your inbox. The Severan Dominate also stretches across several worlds, which were brought into the secessionist movement via diplomacy and guile, rather than outright force. Meaning that we can also explore several of the more usual motivations for a secessionist movement, because, well, there are lots of good reasons to try and secede from the Imperium. At least, reasons that seem good at first flush. Everything from personal ambition, as is the case of the Severan Dominant, to squabbles over tithe structures, or interpretations of imperial faith, or genuine oppression of the native populace, as is the case on a large number of imperial worlds. Regardless of the reason, however, and no matter how morally justifiable it might be, secessionist movements are rarely long-lived, as the Imperium takes personal insult at the continued existence of a secessionist state within its borders, and will usually go to considerable lengths to stomp it out as quickly as possible. Because the secessionist movement is not just merely a threat to the Imperium in the respect that it might spread, and that other worlds might decide that, hey, if they can do it, we can too, but it is an area in Imperial control that is now severed from it. Which means that it is eminently vulnerable to the countless far more dangerous enemies of humanity to move in and occupy that space. A single secessionist system, or even a collection of secessionist planets, is not really a military threat to the Imperium, but nor is it a military threat to Chaos Marauders, or Tyranid splinter fleets, or Orc wargs, etc. It is essentially a hollow spot within the Imperium, a weak joint in the armor that can, with relative ease, be exploited by its enemies. And whilst a secessionist movement, at least in the early stages, tends to be relatively easy to stomp out, a full-fledged chaos stronghold in that same area can be considerably more problematic. Fortunately for the Imperium, most secessionist movements die long before they actually get to the point of seceding, as obviously local law enforcement is not going to be particularly sympathetic to their cause, nor are imperial governors, or the Inquisition, or the forces of the Officio Assassinorum. There are plentiful objects in the way of any budding secessionist. But in some cases, it comes from a quarter so unexpected that the Imperium is not even aware that there is a threat of secession until it is far too late to actually stop it. Such was the case of the creation of the Severan Dominate, because the man who would go on to found it did not steal his position from imperial authorities, he was granted it through legal means. By and large, anyways, but we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Our story begins way back in time, long before the birth of the creator of the Dominant, during the Angevin Crusade, which was the one that liberated the Calixes sector and created the Periphery subsector. One of the great heroes of the Angevin Crusade was a man by the name of Severus, now known as Severus I. He was an extraordinarily ambitious individual who had set his sights on a seat at the highest table in the Imperium, that of the High Lords of Terror. His problem was that he was not particularly well liked by the current incumbents of the other positions on that most august of councils, who suspected him of having engaged in a great deal of immoral dealings to get there. Now, no one ever reaches such a lofty peak without the occasional dirty deed, but the whole point is you're not supposed to be discovered, and Severus had a preponderance of evidence against him, shall we say. But there was no good reason to deny him the seat, so the High Lords instead decided to dodge the question by granting him a near equal honor. They gave him a warrant of trade, thereby making him a rogue trader and allowing him to establish a rogue trader house and a dynasty. This is an enormous honor that grants near unequal freedom within the Imperium, but it came with a little bit of a catch. His warrant of trade was for the Calixes sector. At the time, the target of a crusade and infested by all manners of horrible xenos monstrosities. Thus, whilst in theory this warrant would allow Severus to seize an enormous amount of territory and earn for himself riches beyond imagining, it was only if he managed to kill all of the current occupants of that enormous territory and those immeasurable riches. The High Lords of Terror figured that he'd get himself killed, or disgraced at the very least, and that would be the end of it. Tragically, Severus turned out to be a far more resourceful individual than the High Lords gave him credit for. And not only did he not die, he thrived on the front line, to the point where he was in danger of becoming the leading figure of the entire crusade, despite yet further questionable decisions being taken. Fortunately, there was an equally august man amongst the leadership of the Angevin Crusade, a man by the name of Drusus. Both he and Severus were but two commanders in this enormous military undertaking, commanded overall by Lord General Militant Golgina Angevin. Drusus, however, was a very different military leader than Severus. While Severus committed multiple grand deeds and conquered many worlds in name at least, of the Emperor, Severus had more of an interest in securing the worlds he conquered rather than expanding too quickly. And by securing, I mean placing as much of his personal stamp on them as humanly possible. These worlds were built up to be his de facto fiefdoms, and he was allowed to do this because, well, he did have an excuse. The Angevin Crusade was ongoing. It was under constant threat from outside forces. The Xenos remained perfidious, and Orc wargs were rolling into their paths in a ever-continuing cycle, and so there was no reason to not fortify some planets here and there, and if all of the planets also happened to be ruled by distant relatives, then, well, you know, coinky-dinky-winkies are common occurrences in war. But this would actually end up being Severus's downfall. For whilst he was busy tightening his grip, Drusus continued earning a name for himself and continued playing deftly at the games of politics as well. Until the popularity of his name began to eclipse that of Severus. Severus did not take this particularly well, and there are plentiful rumors that Drusus was the victim of many accidents. But, being a rather doughty fellow, neither assassins' bullets nor poisoned wines could lay him low. And by the time Severus realized what a pinch he was really in, Drusus had gained all the allies he required, including vociferous support from the High Lords of Terror, which guaranteed him the backing of the Inquisition, and in trade for future concessions, the Departamento Munitorum also rallied fully behind Drusus, to the point where, when Lord General Militant Golgina Angevin died, apparently due to a combination of advanced age and being massively fat, the choice of the next Lord General Militant was a simple one, and it went, of course, to Drusus, allowing him to fully eclipse Severus and dispatch his previous rival to far less important battlefront, from which Severus's name would never fully recover. By the time the Angevin Crusade finally came to an end, and the Calixes sector was officially declared, Lord General Militant Drusus exchanged his title for that of Lord Sector Calixes, whilst Severus languished in relative irrelevancy on his handful of conquered planets. Now, being a planetary governor over more than one world ought to be enough for anyone, but, well, show me a man who's truly happy with what he has, and I'll show you a liar, as they say. Severus XIII died cursing his fate, and making damn sure that his son and heir knew exactly how dirty their family had been done. Over the generations, the Severus' hatred of the Imperium only grew stronger, in part because their ancient enemy, Drusus, was actually turned into an imperial saint about 100 years later. Meanwhile, the Severus clan, let's call them that, fortunes only diminished over time, as they lost more and more of their influence, more and more of their holdings, and more of their riches, as one inept son after another tried and failed to fulfill their father's ambition. Yeah, their father had made a lot of enemies, after all, and nobody were overly interested in shaking up the established power structure of the Calixes sector or the periphery. Until, finally, we come to the time of Severus the 13th. Like his predecessors, he had lost none of the butt hurt of their supposed mistreatment over the years, but he had none of his predecessors' wealth, nor their influence. Severus the 13th was, by relevant standards, a impoverished noble, owning nothing more than a enormous mansion built on a couple hundred square kilometers of land. A poor pauper, relatively speaking. And politically, the Severus' star had never been lower. But what Severus the 13th did possess that his predecessors did not was a brain between his ears, and a willingness to use it to try and re-establish his family's name. Severus the 13th began a lengthy campaign of political agitation. He made a lot of promises and used what wealth was left to him to secure various alliances. He also threw away any sense of scruples and morals. In this way, his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather and him were quite similar. And so, whenever a political competitor would arise to challenge him, they would soon fall down a lengthy flight of stairs with some broken glass at the bottom, or be involved in tragic workout accidents where heavyweights would fall on their larynxes, choking them to death. Those with sense swiftly realized that running against Severus the 13th in anything more important than a local baking competition would invariably end in their swift death at the hands of callous misfortune. It didn't take long until Severus the 13th was planetary governor of the very self-same world that he once just had a minor summer retreat on. But that, of course, was just the beginning. His family had far grander aims than that. But now that he was a planetary governor, there were a lot more strings that could be pulled. And his talent for dark and dubious deeds was about to level up quite a bit, as he got in contact with a dark eldar cabal, the Children of Thorns. How the hell he managed to get that connection is anyone's guess, but he did, and he certainly had something very valuable to offer them. Like most Dark Eldar, the Children of Thorn Cabal were interested in acquiring slaves. As always, it is simply what they do, but they aren't interested in working too hard for them, or getting their heads blasted off by heavy bolter shells, or lasguns, or basilisks, or anything of that sort. The more undefended the target, the better, and, well, a planetary governor, he's the kind of guy that could make sure that certain targets are, not as well reinforced as others. And so he made them a promise. If they were to aid him in his rise to local sector governor, then he would make sure that there were always plentiful picking to be had. A mutually beneficial arrangement. Now that Severus was a planetary governor, he had access to a great deal of the back-end workings of a local sector governorship. And so he knew where supplies were, where reinforcements were, where money was being allocated, where troops were being allocated. and so he could tell his new friends exactly where to strike for maximum effect. In return, this would destabilize the planets being raided. It would destabilize the political position of the governors of those planets. It would destabilize their entire wings of politics, as in all levels of imperial governance, there are alliances. Some planetary governors are buddies with others. They scratch each other's backs and make sure that they've got whatever they need whenever they need it. Severus XIII was able to interfere with this delicate balance of political power, making sure that he always came out looking just glorious, and all of his enemies like incompetent dolts. What is this? All of the governors in Severus's factions are doing great. They have an abundance of resources, which tends to, appear at their spaceports with the markings of the previous recipient mysteriously scraped off. But hey, details, Nobody's going to question an extra shipment of food, to be sure. That would be silly. Don't you know, people are hungry, goddammit. Meanwhile, the ones in the opposite factions, well, they can't seem to deal with anything. They've got public upheaval all over their realms. They've got food riots, they've got strikes, and then there's the goddamn aliens that keeps raiding them because they're weak. Oh, clearly, the Severus faction is the way to go, and the moment a new lord joined that faction, oh, wouldn't you know it, mysterious supplies started showing up there as well, and the piratical activity almost completely ceased. Miracles. It got to the point where the only true contender for the seat of Lord Subsector was, you guessed it, Severus XIII, who was, of course, overwhelmed by the honor about to be shown him. A humble planetary governor being granted one of the highest ranks in the realm? Oh, well, he came from humble beginnings, of course, but if Lord Sector Calixes Marius Hex deemed that his humble family was worthy of such a stately position, then who was he to refuse? The worst part is, the current Lord Sector of the Calixes sector, Marius Hex, once again, actually knew perfectly well what Severus XIII was doing. Suddenly, his area, the periphery, is overrun with dark eldar raiders. Supplies are suddenly not arriving where they're supposed to. Tithes are constantly being disturbed, and anyone who runs up against him dies an unfortunate death at aforementioned raiders' hands. 2 + 2 = cunt. But political considerations meant that, well, Severus was, in essence, the only person running for the office. Marius had no other reasonable alternatives, and even if you choose to simply let the office open, he would be overrun by petitioners and higher lords demanding to know what good reasons he had to not appoint the obviously more than qualified Severus XIII for the job. And so it was. Now, Lord Subsector, Severus had achieved everything he wanted, or had he? Well, again, there was the question of the High Lords, who had done his many times over great-grandfather dirty, after all. And what had the Imperium ever done for Severus XIII? Well, except occasionally shit in his general direction. No. His family had a legitimate hereditary claim to the periphery subsector, and so there was no reason why it shouldn't be his and his alone. He'd even come up with a fancy little name for it, the Severan Dominate. Now, there was still a long way to go. Many of the other planetary governors were not quite ready to jump aboard this train. There was also the fact that the periphery was an extraordinarily religious part of the Imperium, and seceding from the realm of the Emperor was gonna be a tough sell. Also, the problem was that, well, his arch-rival Drusus was literally a saint and revered by many in the area. Well, problems aplenty, but nothing that Severus the 13th and his Drukhari allies could not solve, so it was best to get started. But what's that sound off in the distance? Oh yes, an orc horde. As Warg Grimtooth suddenly, out of nowhere, descended on the periphery in a tidal wave of screaming, roaring, beastish monsters. Best laid plans and all that. None of them ever survived contact with the orcs. But hey, it was just a howling mob of savages, right? Just some Xenos filth, right? It's gonna be a problem to stop that. After all, the Imperium has prepared for just such an eventuality. The periphery and the Calixes sector has been ready for the return of the aliens for centuries now. Well, yes, but in the process of weakening any lords who might be in opposition to Severus, he'd also funneled military resources away from the worlds in the sector. You know, military resources that were supposed to be building up fortifications and fleets and PDF forces and, you know, all of the things intended to stop an alien invasion. Whoops. And so the orcs found easy picking, just like the Drukhari did. And speaking of the Dark Eldar, they were now getting a bit grumpy as well. Hold on there, Severus, you promised us easy pickings, and yet now there's hordes of greenskins rampaging around. They're not fun to fight, and your worlds are ever dwindling. And the worlds that we're allowed to target because they're your rivals, well, there's practically none of them left. You aren't holding up your part of the deal, human. And just to emphasize the point, in case Severus had somehow missed it, the Dark Eldar raids now started hitting worlds indiscriminately. Who'd have thought it? The Dark Eldar, untrustworthy business partners. The shockers just will not stop for Severus the 13th. And so his brand new little mini empire was getting overrun from all sides, and mysteriously enough, no aid from the other subsectors were arriving. Mysterious. At first, Severus refused any demands that he ask for help himself, even going so far as to execute those who suggested he do so. But as the orcs grew ever closer to his own home world, he eventually relented and dispatched dozens of emissaries to Marius Hax's court, most of which never made it due to, yet further accidents. Somebody apparently had taken a vested interest in making sure that Severus's little domain was overrun. You know, normally we'd be making guesses like, oh, it was probably the Inquisition, or maybe Lord Sector Calixes Marius Hax, or maybe one of Severus the 13th's local enemies, or maybe the Dark Eldar. The problem is, the list of enemies at this point who might be assassinating his emissaries have grown damned long indeed, and odds are there were more than one of them engaged in dealing with them. Unfortunately, Severus managed to get one of his emissaries through, and an important one at that. As Severus's own granddaughter arrived on the world of Scintilia, which was the seat of Lord Sector Calixes Marius Hax, who couldn't very well refuse to see her because, well, it's the granddaughter of an imperial official. Can't just show her the door. Gotta be allowed to say her piece and all that. But, however, there is no part of official imperial protocol that says that you can't then laugh your ass off at her once she's done, which is exactly what Hax did, as he mocked any request for aid for Severus the 13th. Now, unfortunately, after sitting on his ass for as long as he possibly could, the orc threat was growing quite large, to the point that if it overran the periphery, it might very well continue on into the rest of the sector at large as well. And so Marius had to grudgingly begin dispatching Imperial Guard forces. Now, luckily, he knew what Severus's game was, and therefore he obviously denied any demands or requests made by local Imperial officials to, take over the responsibility for the Imperial Guard forces. No, that will not be necessary, Marius explained, as the Imperial Guard moved in and set up military dictatorships on every planet they arrived on, essentially and quite neatly refolding them back into the Imperium before Severus's secessionist movement had even gotten going. Which, incidentally, finally gets us to the point of secessionism, as Severus the 13th now knew that his time was running out rather rapidly. The Dark Eldar were at best paying lip service to their deal, mouthing along like, oh yes, we'll totally do this and this, and then continuing to raid his worlds, or whichever world showed any sign of weakness, really. Meanwhile, the orcs were still rampaging through the subsector. Marius Hax's Imperial Guard forces were occupying planet after planet. In short, Severus's little personal empire was crumbling rapidly. If he was going to make a move, it had best be now or never. Most of the preparations were at this point in place, and the plans just needed to be carried out. The plan would be much the same as he had used previously. Planets of dubious loyalty would be deprived of supplies, of reinforcements, of food, of ammunition, of building material, of all of the necessary things not just for day-to-day continued existence, but for their ability to resist the roving raiders and the marauding orcs and greenskins. Severus, of course, had no idea where these supplies were heading. Clearly, the Imperium was to blame. Marius Hax, you see, was an incompetent hack. And was misappropriating funds. Severus was doing everything in his power to make sure that those who needed it the most would get it, but he was but a humble sub-sector governor. He could not be everywhere at once, but fret not. He would give them some of his own supplies. Yes, once things hit rock bottom, he would always arrive on a planet at the head of a massive relief column of his own private resources. Again, with the Imperial Aquila neatly scraped off the side there, of course. Unsurprisingly, this saw Severus become a very, very, very popular man very, very, very quickly. And many openly asked for him to lead some sort of separate government, some sort of localized form of governance. Not a secession, of course. And Severus too agreed, no, a secession was a matter of absolute last resort. Obviously, we'll try diplomacy first, but that silly Marius Hax, I'm sure he won't listen. And so slowly but surely, more and more planets became his de facto allies, until the official declaration of the Severan Dominate. And to be fair, for all of Severus's planning and plotting, Manius Hax had been sparse on his relief supplies as well, because from his point of view, it was way better if the orcs dealt with Severus and his loyalist worlds, because the ones that were truly loyal simply wouldn't let his Imperial Guard reinforcements near them in any substantial numbers, or demanded that they were sent merely as reinforcements to their own rather bloated PDF forces. Suspicious. But obviously he could not take a declaration of secession lying down. If it was possible, he would undoubtedly have dispatched enough troops to quash the secession immediately, but larger concerns got in the way, as there were major wars playing out across the Imperium at this time, meaning that the Lord Sector just didn't have the troops to dispatch, at the very least not right now, and so he had to lean back and again hope that the orcs would take care of the rebellious governors for him. Incidentally, Severus had kind of the same plan. He couldn't stop the orcs, they were, well, being orcs, but maybe, just maybe, he could make them fight some of his enemies, as right now, he did have a lot of those. The Imperial Guard was breathing down his neck. The Dark Eldar Cabal was equally so, nibbling at his earlobes. And then there was the orcs roaring in his face, along with the fact that, well, he'd been giving out a lot of his own supplies as well, and now that they were known more coming from the Imperium, they really were his own supplies. He'd made a lot of grand promises to the various world who now made up parts of his dominant, like increased freedoms, greater supplies, more food reserves, etc., etc. All they would have to do is, buck it up right now. They had to muscle through the storm and secure victory, and then there would be nothing but green fields ahead. Severus did not have the ability to actually fulfill any of these promises, but, well, so long as nobody knows that, it's not a problem. Hell, politicians in our day as well have made literal careers out of promising the sky and delivering nothing but the dirt in their outhouses. But even for a master manipulator like Severus, he knew that there was a limit to how long he could continue to offer up literal shit instead of the bread that he had promised. Getting the orcs to attack the Imperials rather than him was therefore the first step in his plan. And hey, he had manipulated sector governors. He had essentially conquered an entire subsector with nothing more than his silvered tongue. Surely a bunch of green-skinned brutes would prove no challenge at all. And so he set about it using his usual tactics. With a wink and a nod here and there, he went, "Oh no, Mr. Greenskins, it would surely be a terrible tragedy if you were to attack over here," wink wink, nod nod. And the Greenskin looked at him and went, "Oh, gotcha." And then attacked over there because, it would be a terrible shame if they attacked over there. And so obviously that's what the orcs are going to do because, well, they kind of want it to be a terrible shame. In general, the orcs simply proved to be too stupid to manipulate. The beauty of orcs. Incidentally, we have been so lucky as to capture some live footage from Severus XIII's palace as he, sees the outcome of his negotiations with the orcs. Pay close attention and you will see the precise moments when the news reaches him. The beauty of orc political intrigue. But despite the many enemies pressing in around him on every side, the Severan Dominate is actually putting up a pretty damn decent fight. Now, in part, this is due to the fact that they have managed to pilfer a great deal of Imperial Guard resources over the years, to the point where the Severan Dominate's armed forces are actually pretty damn competent and relatively well equipped as well, equally on par with most Imperial Guard regiments. They are also inhabiting worlds that have been prepared for the encounter of outside threats for a very, very long time, as Severus was never under any sort of illusions that he wouldn't have to fight the Imperium at some point or another. He also has the advantage of a rather fanatically devoted populace who is of the opinion that the Imperium are the ones who have failed them. It was the Imperium who didn't come to their aid in their hour of need. In fact, it is the Imperium that is at fault for their current hour of need, and Severus, Saint Severus, is the only one who cares. Playing upon this sentiment, Severus has been able to mobilize a tremendous quantity of his population to fight desperately and in a very determined fashion to maintain their independence. Again, hoping that all of Severus's promises will one day come true. If only they can win a victory now, then their descendants will have freedom, they will have prosperity, they will have all the goods and glories of independence, and no longer need to live as the slaves of a distant, uncaring Imperium. It is a tempting line of rhetoric, but whether or not Severus will be able to actually keep it up, whether or not he will be able to deliver upon his promises, or if his empire will collapse from the inside out when it becomes clear that he doesn't actually possess the horn of plenty that he claims, well, that is a question for the future, as the storyline of the Severan Dominant is ongoing, or, well, frozen forever in time is perhaps the more likely outcome, as most of this, of course, comes from the only war role-playing game sourcebooks, which are unlikely to see an expansion, ever. And we all know how GW is when it comes to continuing the storyline. It tends to be deadlocked for a few decades, and then everything changes overnight, with the introduction of a handful of ridiculous Mary Sue characters and the galaxy literally erupting in two. Ugh. Rising Storm be damned. But judging solely by the coolness of their uniforms, I do hope that the Severan Dominate holds out for a nice long while, because that Roman inspiration, it is rather neat, and it's nice to see some humans using it instead of merely the vanilla ultra smurfs. But that will be all for today. Until next time, I, as always, have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.